In The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, Episode 10, The Twilight Zones, the investigation doesn't begin with a launch, a signal burst, or a piece of equipment failing in real time. It begins with something quieter, and somehow more unsettling than that. Two old homesteads. Two decaying structures left behind by another era. At first glance, they look like remnants of history, the kind of forgotten places that sit undisturbed until weather and time finish the work of erasing them. But in this episode, those ruins do not feel abandoned. They feel as if they have been waiting. That is what gives this hour its tension almost immediately. The team is not simply revisiting a familiar hotspot or reacting to another unexpected instrument reading. They are moving toward the past, and in doing so, they begin to suspect that the past may not be separate from the anomalies at all. These structures are not introduced as scenery. They are introduced like witnesses. Silent, incomplete, holding a pattern no one fully understands yet. And that changes the psychological temperature of the episode. Because once you ask why two crumbling homesteads matter now, you are no longer looking at the ranch as an open field of random incidents. You are looking at it as a place with memory. A place where locations may retain significance long after the people who built on them are gone. What initially seems like an ordinary historical detour slowly begins to feel like the opening move in something more precise. As the investigation unfolds, the real unease comes from the possibility that these ruins are not simply connected to the ranch's story. They may actually help organize it. They may point toward a hidden relationship between where people once lived and where unexplained responses continue to emerge. And if that is true, then this is not just another experiment. It is a shift in perspective. A suggestion that the land has been giving off clues for much longer than anyone realized, and that this episode may be the moment those clues start lining up. There is a reason Skinwalker Ranch continues to command attention beyond the language of folklore or speculation. Whatever one believes about the claims surrounding it, the ranch has become a landscape where ordinary geography repeatedly collides with extraordinary interpretation. Hills, ridgelines, open ground, drainage paths, mesa walls, and clearings are never treated as just scenery here. They are treated as variables, as possible triggers, as coordinates in a place where environmental consistency often appears unstable. That is what makes the two old homesteads so significant in this episode. They are not impressive structures. They do not look like centers of revelation. In another context, they might pass without comment. But here, on land already associated with signal fluctuation, electromagnetic disturbance, unexplained aerial responses, and persistent baseline deviation, the presence of these decaying sites takes on a different gravity. Suddenly, the ranch feels less like a collection of isolated anomaly zones and more like an archive, layered, accumulative, holding physical traces of choices made long before modern monitoring systems arrived. And there is something uniquely compelling about that shift. High-tech investigations often create spectacle. Screens light up, sensors react, triangulation data begins to move, but ruins do something different. They slow the investigation down. They force attention toward placement, intention, and the possibility that history itself might be functioning like evidence. A collapsed wall or an old foundation cannot generate urgency on its own. It only becomes urgent when investigators begin to suspect that its position matters. That is the tension building here. Not merely whether the ranch still produces anomalies, but whether those anomalies have always been tied to specific locations in ways people are only now beginning to recognize. The homesteads become anchors between then and now, suggesting that whatever the team is pursuing may not be new at all. It may have been embedded in the layout of the land from the beginning. And if the present investigation is converging with forgotten human occupation, then this episode is not just about discovery. It is about rereading the ranch itself, as if the terrain has been refusing silence all along. One of the most important things this episode does is narrow its focus. That may sound counterintuitive in a place famous for broad, unpredictable phenomena, but the decision to examine the relationship between two old sites is exactly what gives the investigation its force. Up to this point, The ranch often invites a wide-angle mindset. Observers are encouraged to think in terms of multiple hotspots, intermittent responses, scattered incidents, and a landscape that resists clean explanation. But the Twilight Zones turns away from that sprawl and moves towards something more deliberate. The question becomes simple on the surface. Why these two homesteads? Why return attention to structures that appear irrelevant beside the more dramatic incidents the ranch is known for? The answer is not spectacle. It is method. If two abandoned locations begin to suggest correspondence, alignment, or repeated significance, then the investigation gains a kind of internal logic that is often harder to dismiss. Instead of chasing anomaly after anomaly, the team begins testing the possibility of relationship. And relationship is where patterns begin. This is the turning point that changes the documentary texture of the episode. The team is no longer just observing unexplained events as they happen. They are pursuing structure. They are asking whether there is a reason certain places continue to matter, and whether overlooked human-built sites might help expose that reason. It is a move away from reaction and toward inference, away from isolated mystery and toward mapped implication. That also makes the stakes feel larger, not smaller. Because once attention tightens, every detail becomes more meaningful. Distance matters. Orientation matters. Placement matters. The investigation begins to suggest that what seems decayed and irrelevant may actually be central, and that naturally opens a deeper curiosity loop. Are these homesteads linked historically, geographically, or symbolically? Were they chosen for practical reasons, or is there some environmental inconsistency beneath them that earlier occupants recognized without understanding? The episode does not rush to answer. It simply pushes the viewer into a new mental frame, where ruins are no longer passive reminders of the past. They are active prompts, demanding to be compared. Once the episode begins treating the homesteads as meaningful locations rather than historical leftovers, the entire ranch starts to feel different. A ruin usually invites reflection. It suggests absence. It tells us something ended there. But in this investigation, the old homes begin to function less like memories and more like markers. Their decay is almost irrelevant compared to their position. What matters is not what remains above ground, but what their placement may reveal beneath the narrative everyone thought they understood. That is a profound conceptual shift. Because the moment a structure becomes a coordinate, it enters a different category of evidence. You stop asking what life was like there and start asking why that exact point on the land was occupied at all. Was it proximity to water? Shelter? Visibility? Access? Or could there be another layer? One that the original settlers never described in formal terms but responded to instinctively? A place that seemed favorable, or unnerving, or unusually active in ways too subtle to document but too persistent to ignore. The power of this section lies in how it slowly introduces geometry into the mystery. Not in an abstract sense, but in a grounded investigative sense. 2 points on a landscape invite comparison. They suggest a line. They suggest orientation. They suggest the possibility that the land has its own invisible organization and that these structures, whether intentionally or coincidentally, sit on important thresholds within it. That is where the unease deepens. Because if these old sites are not random, then the ranch may not be random either. The episode begins to imply that the true map of Skinwalker Ranch may not be the one visible on paper. It may be a map of recurring environmental inconsistency, intermittent signal interference, and locations that repeatedly attract human attention for reasons no one can fully articulate. In that context, the homesteads become more than relics. They become clues to a deeper spatial logic. And the investigation subtly changes from observing strange phenomena to asking whether the terrain itself is arranged in ways people have only partially detected. The ruins are still silent, but now they seem to be pointing. Every strong investigative episode has a moment when atmosphere becomes evidence, when curiosity hardens into consequence. In the Twilight Zones, that shift arrives when the team encounters the first discovery that makes the connection between the two homesteads feel less speculative and more real. It does not need to be dramatic in the conventional sense. In fact, what makes it effective is the opposite: a detail, a correspondence, a measured response. Something subtle enough that it could have been missed, but concrete enough that once seen, it cannot be unseen. This is where the emotional tone changes. Before this point, the investigation carries the cautious energy of a working hypothesis. The team is exploring, comparing, probing for relationship. But after that first meaningful indication, the mood becomes reactive. Attention sharpens. Pauses get longer. Reactions become quieter, not louder. And that restraint is precisely what gives the moment weight. Because when experienced investigators stop speaking for a beat, when faces shift from curiosity to recognition, the viewer understands that the ground beneath the investigation has moved. What makes this discovery powerful is not simply what it shows, but what it implies. Even a small confirmed link between the sites suggests that the ranch may be operating less like a collection of scattered oddities and more like a system. A system with repeated responses, repeated placements, repeated conditions. And once that possibility enters the frame, everything that came before starts to reorganize itself around it. Formerly isolated events begin to look like fragments of a pattern that no one had the right angle to see. This is also where documentary pacing becomes crucial. The episode allows the realization to land. It gives space to the silence around the evidence, to the unspoken calculation happening in real time as investigators begin revising their assumptions. Because the real significance is not just that the team found something. It is that what they found may connect distant points across the ranch in a way that changes the logic of future inquiry. If one connection exists, then the obvious next question follows immediately. How many others have been there all along, hidden in plain sight? Once the first connection is recognized, the investigation begins to widen again, but this time with more structure than before. The question is no longer whether the two homesteads are linked in some meaningful way. The question becomes what kind of pattern that link belongs to. And that is where the episode grows more intellectually absorbing. The viewer is no longer just watching the team gather information. The viewer is being invited to assemble a model. Patterns are dangerous things in a place like Skinwalker Ranch. They can clarify, but they can also mislead. They tempt interpretation. They encourage observers to draw lines between events that may not belong together. And yet, without pattern recognition, no investigation moves forward at all. This episode understands that tension. It doesn't rush towards certainty. Instead, it carefully expands the implications of what has been observed. If the homesteads correspond, do they define a route, a boundary, a corridor of repeated activity? Are they positioned near zones of environmental inconsistency that modern equipment registers as sensor irregularity or electromagnetic disturbance? Or are they part of something more complex, a set of points that only begin to make sense when viewed together? That is what makes the mystery feel increasingly architectural. The ranch stops behaving like a stage where isolated incidents happen and starts feeling like a structured environment with internal relationships. One location begins to inform another. One response seems to echo a previous one, and the possibility emerges that anomalies may cluster, repeat, or intensify according to spatial conditions investigators are only beginning to describe. This is also the phase where restraint matters most. The strongest documentary narration does not force the conclusion ahead of the evidence. It keeps several interpretations alive at once. Perhaps the homesteads reflect practical settlement logic that happens to overlap with later anomaly reports. Perhaps they mark repeated human recognition of unusual terrain. Or perhaps they indicate something even more difficult to define: a persistent interaction between human presence and specific locations that provoke unexplained response. The episode gains power by refusing to flatten those possibilities. Instead, it lets the pattern sharpen slowly, the way an image resolves in low light. Not enough to end the mystery, but enough to make the unknown feel larger and far more organized than it first appeared. Episode titles are often treated like atmosphere, a bit of tonal framing before the real content begins. But in this case, the Twilight Zone starts to read like a clue. Not just an evocative phrase, but a conceptual key to what the team may actually be identifying. Because Twilight is not simply darkness, it is transition, a threshold, a period when definitions soften and certainty becomes more difficult. And when that idea is applied to the ranch, the title begins to suggest that the team is not looking for one singular hotspot. They may be encountering boundary spaces, areas where normal conditions overlap with something less stable. That interpretation changes everything. Instead of imagining the ranch as a place with one center of mystery, the episode hints at the existence of multiple zones of significance, pockets, margins, intersections, places where environmental readings, historical placement, and unexplained response appear to converge. In that sense, Twilight becomes more than mood. It becomes methodology. It describes the kind of space the team may be trying to identify. Not fully ordinary, not fully understood, and not consistently visible unless approached from the right angle. This makes the homestead connection even more disturbing. If these sites are positioned near thresholds rather than isolated events, then the ruins are doing more than helping trace old settlement patterns. They are helping map where the ranch changes character, where it stops behaving predictably, where sensor data and historical placement may be intersecting in ways that challenge the assumption of randomness. The team may not simply be uncovering locations. They may be outlining borders. And borders are inherently unsettling, especially when no one can clearly define what lies on either side of them. That is why the title resonates so strongly by the midpoint of the episode. It retroactively darkens everything that came before. Every irregular reading, every unexplained reaction, every site that seemed interesting but disconnected. Suddenly, those pieces begin to look like responses from within different Twilight zones across the ranch, areas where reality itself seems to become less reliable. The title stops sounding poetic. It starts sounding diagnostic, a name for the spaces where this investigation repeatedly loses the comfort of normal explanation. For all the technology brought into investigations at Skinwalker Ranch, episodes like this remind us that the first people to study a place are often the ones who simply had to live there. That is what gives the homesteads their emotional weight. They are not just structures. They are traces of human routine, of sleep, work, weather, isolation, and repeated exposure to the same horizon. Long before thermal imaging, baseline measurements, and electromagnetic monitoring, there were people waking up in these locations every day and responding to whatever the land gave them. The episode does not need written testimony to make that unsettling. The mere fact of habitation is enough to raise a difficult question. What did they notice? Not necessarily in the language of anomaly, but in the language available to them. Strange livestock behavior, unusual sounds, irregular weather sensations, areas that felt wrong at certain times of day. Repeated unease with no obvious source. Human beings do not need advanced instruments to detect that something in an environment is off. They only need repetition. Enough nights. Enough seasons. Enough unexplained moments accumulating without resolution. That possibility deepens the mystery in a way pure data cannot. Because abandoned homes often preserve uncertainty more effectively than records do. Walls collapse. Roofs fail. Names disappear. But placement remains. And placement suggests that these residents occupied the same coordinates the modern team is now scrutinizing with new tools and new vocabulary. The past and present are not merely parallel here. They overlap. This is where the ranch begins to feel genuinely inhabited by memory, not in a supernatural sense, but in an investigative one. These ruins may represent lived contact with the same environmental inconsistency now being examined through modern methods. The people who stayed there may have recognized patterns they could never formalize, or they may have quietly adapted to conditions no outsider would believe. That ambiguity makes the structures feel heavier. Not empty, but residue-rich. Full of unrecorded observation, full of attention, perhaps even full of warning. And as the episode presses forward, it becomes harder to look at the homesteads as ruins alone. They begin to feel like unanswered questions made physical. At a certain point, an investigation stops being interesting and starts becoming consequential. That threshold is exactly where this episode gains its real strength. Once the connections between the homesteads begin implying that the ranch's anomalies may be spatially linked, the stakes rise sharply. Not because the team has proved a final theory, but because they may have identified a framework capable of reorganizing everything that came before it. That matters. A single unexplained event can always be isolated. A strange reading can be dismissed. A signal disturbance can be blamed on interference. But when multiple locations begin to suggest structure, dismissal becomes harder. Structure implies repetition. Repetition implies condition. And condition implies that what happens on the ranch may not be as chaotic as it appears. It may be contingent, triggered, localized, responsive to placement in ways that future experiments can now pursue with greater precision. This is why connections are often more unnerving than anomalies themselves. An anomaly disturbs expectation. A connection disturbs interpretation. It suggests intention, or at least organization. It forces investigators to consider that the phenomena associated with the ranch may not be emerging at random times in random places. They may belong to a layout, a system of interaction between terrain, history, and present-day sensor response. If that is true, then every previous investigation acquires new context, and every future one becomes more focused. The episode understands the power of that pivot. It does not claim the ranch has been solved. It does something more compelling. It shows that the search may finally be approaching the right shape of question. Not what happened here once, but how are these places related? And what do those relationships predict? That is a much more dangerous question, because prediction is where mystery begins to move toward consequence. Still, the episode wisely leaves room for doubt. Correlation is not proof. Patterns can emerge from incomplete data. Historical placement can overlap with modern anomaly zones for mundane reasons. But uncertainty does not reduce the importance of what the team may have found. If anything, it intensifies it, because now the investigation has direction. Now the ranch is not just producing isolated mysteries. It is hinting at an internal map. And once that possibility exists, the next stage of inquiry becomes unavoidable. What makes the Twilight Zones effective is not that it resolves anything. It doesn't, and it shouldn't. The best investigative endings do not close the mystery. They redefine its scale. By the time this episode reaches its final movements, the viewer is left with something more durable than a conclusion. A sense that overlooked pieces of the ranch's past may be active components in its present, and that what seemed incidental may actually be structurally important. That is the final unease the episode leaves behind. Two ruined homesteads, once easy to dismiss as historical texture, now appear to carry analytical weight. They may be part of a larger hidden pattern across the property. They may indicate that the ranch contains multiple zones of significance rather than a single source of unexplained activity. And perhaps most importantly, they may offer a clue that reframes earlier incidents, suggesting that what investigators have experienced for years is not a loose collection of anomalies, but a set of responses distributed across the land according to a logic no one fully sees yet. This is where the episode becomes more disturbing in retrospect than in real time, because the implications expand after the evidence is presented. If these ruins matter, how many other quiet locations matter too? If thresholds exist, how many have been crossed without recognition? If the ranch has a hidden geometry, how much of the past investigation has been looking at effects without first understanding placement? Those questions remain open, and that openness is exactly what gives the ending its power. There is no grand declaration here. No definitive theory imposed over incomplete information. Instead, the episode leaves the audience in a state of disciplined uncertainty. Enough evidence to feel the pattern, not enough to contain it. Enough convergence to justify deeper investigation, not enough clarity to claim control. And that balance is what makes the final impression linger. Because in the end, the Twilight Zones does not simply suggest that something unusual happened between two old structures. It suggests that the ranch may be revealing itself in layers, and that the next breakthrough may not come from chasing the most dramatic event, but from understanding the quiet coordinates where history, terrain, and unexplained response keep intersecting. The ruins remain where they were. The land remains outwardly unchanged. But after this episode, they are harder to look at innocently. They no longer feel like leftovers. They feel like entry points. And that is a far more unsettling place to leave an investigation than any answer could ever be.